Welcome back to Behind the Genius. Today's story takes us to the year 1799, into the foggy farmlands of Maine. In a village called Hollow's End, three sisters lived on the edge of the marsh. They were known as the Grimshaw sisters. For generations, people whispered that each autumn, when the harvest came, so did something far darker: infants vanishing without a trace. Were these sisters midwives or monsters? And why does the land they lived on still tremble with fear today? This is the terrifying story of the Grimshaw sisters and the harvest of dead infants. Before we step deeper into this chilling mystery, make sure you subscribe to Behind the Genius. When you subscribe, it pushes me to uncover even more terrifying stories that history tried to erase. Your support motivates me to dig deeper, to bring you the darkest secrets the past still hides. Now, let's step into 1799, where the shadows of Hollow's End were said to have teeth. The year was 1799, and in the far reaches of Maine lay a village so small and so cut off that few maps even bothered to mark it. The place was called Hollow's End, a farming settlement built on stubborn land. The soil was rocky, the marshes stretched like black veins around the edges, and the Atlantic winds rolled in thick with salt and fog. The villagers lived hard lives, summers blistered with work in the fields, winters long and cruel. But it was the harvest season that carried the greatest fear. Every autumn, when the grain was cut and the apples ripened, the people of Hollow's End braced themselves for something else that always seemed to come: the disappearance of infants. The pattern was too steady to dismiss as chance. A baby one year, then another the next. Sometimes two gone within the same week. Mothers would wake in the night to find cradles empty, the soft wails that had once filled the cabin silenced. Doors left unbroken, windows unlatched, no footprints in the dirt. It was as if the babies had simply dissolved into the night air. By the time the fields began to yellow, no parent in Hollow's End slept soundly. Candles were kept burning through the night. Fathers kept watch with muskets across their laps. And still, children vanished. And always, after each disappearance, whispers grew louder, circling back to the same name, the Grimshaw sisters. The Grimshaw women lived in a crooked timbered house at the edge of the marshland, a place that looked as though the swamp itself was trying to swallow it whole. The roof sagged, the shutters hung crooked, and moss crept up its walls. By day, smoke would sometimes rise from the crooked chimney, carrying with it the smell of dried herbs or acrid roots burning. By night the windows glowed with candlelight, though no villager ever dared draw close enough to peer inside. To many, it was not a house at all, but a lair, a boundary between Hollow's End and something older, something watching. The sisters were three in number. The eldest, Agnes Grimshaw, was tall, sharp-featured, her face lined though she was not, yet old. She was known for her unyielding voice and her piercing eyes that made farmers shift uncomfortably whenever she passed them in the village. The second, Margaret, was the healer. She gathered herbs from the marsh, brewed teas that could ease fevers or still a cough, but there was always unease about her cures, whispers that she gave as much sickness as she took away. The youngest, Eliza, was barely into her 20s, pale as candle wax, with a shock of dark hair and eyes so light they seemed almost colorless. Children said she could speak to animals, that birds followed her, that when she stood at the edge of the field, crows clustered in the trees as though awaiting her command. They were not seen often in the village. When they did appear, it was for trade, Margaret offering tinctures for butter, Eliza exchanging roots for cloth. But with each child's disappearance, suspicion twisted tighter around them. Women clutched their infants closer when one of the sisters passed. Men spat into the dirt when the sisters' names were spoken. Even the parish priest, Father Callum, who had once argued for reason, began to avoid mentioning them from the pulpit. For generations, the Grimshaw family had lived at Hollow's End. Old folk recalled that the sister's grandmother had been a midwife, present at nearly every birth in the early days of the village. But that grandmother had died suddenly, and after her passing, births seemed to decline while disappearances rose. The villagers told themselves stories, as terrified people always do. Some said the Grimshaw women were witches who fed infants to the marsh to keep their youth. Others said they served a darker god, one that demanded offerings of the unborn in exchange for the village's survival. A few muttered that perhaps the Grimshaws were cursed, bound to repeat some old sin carried down their bloodline. Whatever the truth, one thing united them all: fear, and yet no one acted. The strange thing about Hollow's End was that for all the suspicion, for all the late-night mutterings, the people stopped short of rising against the sisters. Fear had a way of freezing courage, of convincing people that maybe it was safer to endure loss than to provoke something worse. That autumn, the autumn of 1799, fear sat heavier than ever before. The year had been poor for crops. The barley withered too soon, the corn stalks grew weak, and sickness spread among the livestock. By September, families were already counting how little grain they had stored for winter, how thin their herds had grown. When the first infant vanished that season, a boy not yet 2 months old, the grief of his parents broke something inside the village. For weeks afterward, no one spoke of anything else. Mothers refused to leave their cabins, fathers sharpened axes they never used, and each night the marsh seemed to breathe heavier, as though laughing at their fear. Strange signs began to appear as well. Flocks of crows gathering in fields stripped of grain, dead rabbits found on doorsteps, water in the well turning murky overnight. It was Eliza Grimshaw who people claimed they saw at the edge of the fields during that time. Farmers swore they glimpsed her standing in the fog, her pale eyes fixed on the houses of Hollow's End, her hand outstretched as though calling something only she could see. Children claimed they heard a lullaby drifting through the night, soft, low, and cold, though no one dared follow the sound to its source. The second infant went missing in October. This time it was the daughter of a farmer who lived near the marsh. His wife had been sick after childbirth, and Margaret Grimshaw had been the one to bring her healing teas. Some said the baby had been marked from that moment on. The child was gone before sunrise. The mother, half mad with grief, screamed that she had dreamt of women standing at the foot of her bed, whispering lullabies, their faces pale as moonlight. When she woke, her arms were empty. Now the village could not pretend anymore. The harvest was nearly over, their barns half empty, and their children vanishing into smoke. A meeting was called at the church. Every villager crammed into the small, wooden building, candlelight flickering across grim faces. The priest's voice trembled as he spoke. "The Lord may test us, but the devil preys upon us, and I fear the devil has found his servants among us." Though he never named them, everyone knew who he meant. Heads turned toward the marsh. The Grimshaw sisters. The air in Hollow's End grew taut as a drawn bowstring. Suspicion hardened into anger. Men muttered of torches, of muskets, of marching to the Grimshaw house. Mothers clutched their infants as though expecting them to be stolen, even as they sat in the church pews. And yet, when the meeting ended, no one moved. Fear was still stronger than fury. The villagers filed out into the fog, glancing toward the marsh, but walking back to their homes, locking their doors, praying the next cry would not be silenced in their house. The marsh seemed to grow louder that night. The wind rattled the reeds like bones. The frogs croaked in broken rhythms, and crows cawed long after midnight. In the Grimshaw house, 3 women sat together in silence, a single candle between them. Agnes's voice finally broke the stillness. "They are coming." Margaret's eyes lowered, her hands tightening around the wooden cup she held. Eliza only smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the candle flame as though she saw something far beyond it. And in the fields of Hollow's End, a third cradle lay empty by morning. The path to the Grimshaw home was a narrow track that wound from the village into the marsh. Few ever walked it willingly. The marshland was treacherous. Black water pooled beneath reeds, sucking mud waded beneath thin grass, and the fog rolled in heavy as wool. People said that the land itself resisted trespassers, that if you strayed even a step from the path, you would wander in circles until your strength gave out, swallowed by the swamp forever. But the Grimshaw sisters walked it with ease. Their house, a crooked thing of wood and stone, leaned like a weary sentinel at the edge of the marsh. Its windows were small and its timbers sagged, but there was something unnervingly alive about it. Vines curled over the walls, pressing through the cracks between boards. The smell of damp earth and herbs hung in the air. To a villager's eyes, it was not a home but a nest, somewhere unnatural, somewhere waiting. Inside, the air was dim and heavy with smoke. Herbs hung in thick bundles from the rafters, their shapes casting strange shadows. Bottles lined the shelves, filled with cloudy liquids that shifted when touched by light. Animal bones dangled like charms from the beams, clicking softly when the wind crept through the cracks. At the heart of the house, a long wooden table stretched, scarred from knives and stained from years of use. On that October evening, after the third infant vanished, the sisters gathered there. Agnes, the eldest, paced. Her tall frame filled the palm room, her sharp jaw tight with thought. "The village is stirring," she said, her voice low but cutting. "I heard the bell toll last night. They gathered. They spoke of us." Margaret sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were dark, ringed with sleeplessness. Unlike Agnes, there was no fire in her. She carried herself like a woman bearing a weight too great. "Let them speak," she murmured. "Words are not yet fire." But Eliza, the youngest, did not answer. She stood by the small window, her pale face turned toward the fog outside. A faint smile lingered on her lips. "They fear," she whispered, almost to herself. "They smell of it. It clings to them." She lifted her hand slowly, palm open, and a crow dropped from the branch outside, landing upon the sill. Its feathers were slick black, its eyes bright as beads. Eliza stroked its head with a single finger, and the bird did not flinch. Agnes stopped pacing, her eyes hard on her youngest sister. "This cannot last," she said. "The village will not keep silent forever. Each child lost brings them closer to us." Eliza finally turned, the crow hopping from the sill to her shoulder. Her pale eyes caught the candlelight, glowing faintly. "Then let them come," she said. "The marsh will take them too." Margaret flinched. "Enough," she whispered. "There has been enough taking." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, her mask of calm slipped. Her gaze dropped to her hands and she seemed smaller, almost broken. "Do you think I cannot hear them? At night, when the house is still, I hear the cries. Not the villagers, not their whispers, but the children. I hear them." Silence thickened the room. Agnes's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Eliza only tilted her head, her smile faint and unreadable. The marsh outside groaned, as if shifting under some great weight. The crow on Eliza's shoulder gave a low, rattling caw. And then, faintly, from the distance, the sound of the church bell. The sisters froze. The bell tolled once, twice, then thrice. Each strike rolled across the marsh like a warning. "They have decided," Agnes said, her eyes hard as flint, fixed on the others. "The village will rise." In the village, the people of Hollow's End gathered again. Their fear had finally tipped into anger. The latest child to vanish was the son of the miller, a man known for his temper and his strength. His wife, broken with grief, had collapsed. In the church, screaming that she saw Eliza Grimshaw standing outside their home the night before, her pale face shining in the fog. No one asked if it was a dream. No one questioned her grief. The men gathered torches, their faces grim. The women clutched their remaining children, whispering prayers, though their eyes burned with the same fury. Father Callum tried to steady them with words of caution, but his voice was lost beneath the roar of anger. For the first time in years, the village was united. Not in silence, but in purpose. They would go to the marsh. And so, with fire in hand, they set out down the narrow track, the bell still echoing behind them. The fog curled around their ankles, the reeds whispered in the wind, but they pressed on, their boots thudding like drums. The marsh resisted them, it always did. The path seemed to stretch longer, the fog thicker, the ground softer, but anger carried them forward where fear once held them back. At the house, the sisters waited. The torches became visible first, flickering through the fog like eyes. Then came the voices, low and fierce, growing louder. The sisters did not hide. They stood in the doorway, 3 figures against the crooked house, as the villagers emerged from the swamp path. The crowd stopped a dozen paces away, their torches throwing light across the wet ground. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was alive with the crackle of flame, the croak of frogs, the distant caw of crows. Then the miller stepped forward, his face a mask of grief and rage. "Give them back," he roared. His voice cracked, but his fury did not. "Give back the children." "You stole!" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, voices rising. Witches, murderers, thieves of the innocent. The priest raised his cross, his hand trembling. Agnes stepped forward, tall and unflinching. Her voice carried across the marsh. "You blame what? You fear. You see shadows and call them sins. But the truth is this: Hollow's end was doomed long before us." "Lies!" someone shouted. "The children vanish because of you." Margaret stepped beside her sister, her face pale, her hands shaking. "We did not choose this," she said, her voice trembling. "You think we wanted it? That we take joy in these cries? No, you know nothing of what binds us." Her words cracked into a sob, and she clutched her shawl tight around her. The villagers only roared louder. They had come too far to turn back with words. It was Eliza who broke the moment. She stepped forward, the torchlight glinting in her pale eyes. The crow still clung to her shoulder, its wings half spread. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "Do you want to see them?" she asked. The crowd faltered. The question was so strange, so quiet, that it stilled even the miller's fury. Eliza's lips curled into a smile. "The children you seek, do you want to see them?" The silence deepened. Then the miller spat into the dirt. "Show us," he growled, and Eliza raised her hand. The marsh answered. The fog thickened, rolling in waves. The reeds bent, as though something passed through them. The air grew heavy, damp, suffocating. Then, soft cries drifted through the night. Not the cries of birds, not the croak of frogs, infant cries. The villagers froze, torches shaking in their hands. The sound grew louder, surrounding them, coming from the marsh, from the trees, from the very ground. Thin wails, hungry and cold. The cries of infants long gone. Women clutched their children tighter. Men raised their muskets with trembling hands. The priest whispered prayers beneath his breath, and then the first figure appeared. From the fog crawled something small, pale, twisted. A child's form, but wrong. Its eyes were hollow sockets, its mouth open in a silent scream, its tiny hands clawing at the air. Behind it came another, and another. Infants, dozens of them, their bodies bloated with marsh water, their faces sunken, their skin pale as moonlight. They dragged themselves forward, their cries piercing, their tiny hands grasping. The crowd broke into chaos. Mothers shrieked, men stumbled back. Torches fell into the mud, hissing out, and through it all, Eliza stood smiling, her pale eyes shining. The marsh was alive with screams, not the screams of the living, but the cries of the lost, echoing through fog and darkness. The villagers stumbled backward, torches shaking as the pale shapes of infants dragged themselves closer. Their tiny hands clawed at mud, their sunken faces turned toward the crowd, mouths open in endless wails. Some villagers fled at once, vanishing into the fog. Others froze, unable to look away. Mothers clutched their children, shielding their eyes, while men held muskets but did not fire. How could they? These were not wolves, not raiders. These were infants, the very ones they had come to save. Yet, they were wrong, twisted by death, their little bodies waterlogged and stiff, their eyes gone. The miller stood firm, though his face was pale. His fists clenched around the haft of his torch. This is witchcraft," he bellowed. "They mock us with shadows." But the sound of those cries clawed at the heart. No echo of wolves or trickery of men could pierce so deep. The priest dropped to his knees, clutching his cross tight, whispering prayers that quivered with fear. The sisters stood unmoving in the doorway of their crooked house. Agnes watched with her jaw set, her tall frame like a stone against the storm. Margaret trembled, tears streaking her face, as if she too was haunted by the cries. And Eliza only smiled, the crow still perched upon her shoulder, its wings half spread as if in triumph. "Do you see now?" Eliza's voice rang through the marsh, soft yet carrying over the cries. "You begged to see them, and so they come." The villagers recoiled as more shapes rose from the reeds. Tiny arms broke the water's surface, pulling pale forms from beneath, dozens, perhaps more. The cries grew louder, so loud it seemed the very air vibrated with grief. A woman in the crowd screamed, breaking the fragile stillness. She dropped her torch and ran forward, arms outstretched. "My baby," she cried. "My Thomas." She fell to her knees in the mud, reaching for one of the pale shapes crawling toward her. The figure turned its hollow sockets toward her, its small hands clawing, its mouth opening wide in a shriek that split the night. The woman froze. Her scream twisted into a sob, and before anyone could reach her, the pale child's hands closed around her wrist. The villagers rushed forward, pulling her back, but when they tore her arm free, her skin was blistered as though burned with ice. The crowd broke into chaos. Some fled into the fog, their shouts swallowed by the marsh. Others screamed prayers, others curses, and many stumbled back, desperate to escape the crawling figures that surged from the water and mud. "Hold!" the priest shouted, though his voice shook. He lifted his cross high, but the cries of the infants did not falter. They circled the villagers now, crawling in dozens, their pale forms pressing in from all sides. Agnes stepped forward at last, her voice cutting through the screams. "Enough, Eliza." But Eliza did not turn. Her pale eyes shone, her smile sharp. They asked for truth. Now they choke on it. Margaret clutched at her sister's arm, her own face streaked with tears. "Stop this, Eliza. Stop it before." "There is no turning back." Eliza finally turned to them, her gaze colder than the marsh water itself. "There is no turning back. Not for us. Not for them. The bargain was struck long ago." Her words hung heavy, striking something deep in the villagers. Bargain. The word sank like a stone into the chaos. Bargain with what? Bargain for what? The miller, face twisted with fury, stepped forward, raising his musket. "Then you'll die for it," he shouted. He leveled the gun at Eliza. The shot cracked through the night, louder than the cries. Smoke curled from the barrel. Eliza did not fall. The bullet struck her square in the chest. Yet when the smoke cleared, she stood unmoving. Slowly she tilted her head, her pale eyes fixed on the miller. She opened her mouth and a soft cry emerged. Not her voice, but the thin wail of an infant. The miller dropped his gun, stumbling back as if struck himself. His torch fell into the mud, hissing out. His hands shook violently, his face drained of color. The villagers, already breaking, now shattered. Screams rose, torches scattered. Some men tried to fight, swinging clubs and knives, but their blows cut only air. The pale infants swarmed closer, their cries deafening, their hands clutching at boots, skirts, skin. Those who touched them burned, with cold, their flesh turning white and stiff. Through it all, the sisters stood in the doorway. Agnes's jaw trembled, though she tried to hide it. Margaret sobbed openly, her hands covering her ears as though to block the cries. And Eliza? Eliza's smile widened, her face lit by the torchlight, as if she drew joy from the terror. "Run if you can," she whispered. "The marsh keeps what it takes." And with that, the fog closed in. The cries rose higher, louder, until it seemed the very air would split apart. The torches vanished one by one. The priest's prayers broke into screams. The villagers fled into the swamp, but the marsh swallowed sound, swallowed light, swallowed hope. By dawn, the path to the Grimshaw house was empty again. The reeds bent gently in the wind. The fog clung low. No footprints marked the mud. Only the faint sound of crying, drifting across the marsh before fading into silence. Inside the crooked house, the sisters sat once more at their long wooden table. Agnes's hands shook as she pressed her palms to her face. Margaret sat hollow-eyed, rocking slightly, whispering prayers to herself. And Eliza, pale and smiling, stroked the crow on her shoulder. "They will not come again," she said softly. "The marsh has chosen." Outside, unseen beyond the fog, dozens of tiny shapes shifted in the reeds, waiting. The marsh lay quiet at dawn, as though nothing had happened. The fog was thick, swallowing the horizon. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rot. Birds did not sing. No footsteps disturbed the mud. It was as if the night had erased itself. But inside the crooked house of the Grimshaw sisters, the silence was different. Agnes sat hunched at the wooden table, staring at her calloused hands. Her torch from the night before lay blackened beside her, its flame long gone. Margaret sat across from her, lips moving silently in prayer, her eyes swollen from weeping. Eliza, however, sat tall in her chair, her crow perched on the backrest, its head cocked as though listening. "Do you hear it?" Eliza whispered, her pale eyes fixed on the window where fog pressed against the glass. Agnes shifted, though she did not look up. "Hear what?" "The crying," Eliza said, a strange smile tugging at her lips. "They're still out there, waiting." Margaret shook her head violently. "Stop it. Stop speaking of them." She clasped her hands tight, knuckles white. "We should leave this place, Agnes. We should run before it takes us too." "Run where?" Eliza asked sharply, her voice cold. "You think the marsh lets anyone go?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside, the fog pressed close, almost alive. Agnes finally raised her head, her face pale, but her eyes hard. "This has gone far enough, Eliza. Last night, you saw what happened. You heard them. The villagers are gone. All of them." Eliza leaned forward, her voice low. "And why do you think they are gone, Agnes? Because they would not understand. Because they would never let us live. Do you remember what they called us when we were children? Cursed, tainted, born of sin." Her words dripped with venom. "And they were right," Margaret gasped, clutching at her rosary. "Don't say such things." But Agnes's face stiffened. "What do you mean, they were right?" Eliza's smile widened. The crow fluttered its wings as though stirred by her words. "Do you really think it was chance that Mother died the way she did? That every child we bore into this world slipped away? No, Agnes. It was never chance. It was the marsh, and it has always claimed its due." Agnes's throat tightened. Memories clawed their way up. Their mother's body, pale and still. The tiny graves in the swampy earth, the whispers that followed them every time they entered the village. "You knew," Agnes whispered, her voice breaking. Eliza leaned back in her chair, her pale fingers tracing the edge of the table. "Not at first, but the night I heard the first cry in the reeds, I understood. The marsh does not just take. It gives, but only to those willing to give in return." Margaret's hands trembled as she pressed her rosary to her lips. "You bargained." Eliza's eyes gleamed. "Yes." Agnes slammed her fist against the table, the sound echoing through the room. "What did you give it, Eliza?" The crow cawed sharply, as though answering for her. Eliza's smile softened, but her eyes did not. "I gave it what it already wanted. The stillborn, the weak, the unwanted. I carried them to the reeds myself, and in return, it gave me life. It gave us power." Margaret let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. "Monster." But Eliza's smile did not falter. "No, Margaret. Survivor." She leaned closer, her pale eyes catching the faint light. "Do you think we would still be alive without it? Do you think the villagers would have let us live, childless, cursed, out here on their edge? No. They would have drowned us years ago, tied to stones and thrown into the marsh. But the marsh chose us instead. Agnes's face twisted in fury, but beneath her anger was fear, a deep gnawing fear that her sister spoke the truth. She had always wondered why they lived when others did not, why sickness never touched them, why the marsh, which swallowed men whole, never swallowed them. Eliza, Agnes's voice trembled. Those infants last night, were they? Eliza cut her off with a sharp nod. Every single one, all the lives taken too soon, all the blood poured into the reeds. They are ours now, bound to us. They cry because they remember. Margaret let out a scream, shoving back from the table. No, they were children, innocent. You cannot bind them like beasts. Eliza's expression hardened. Do you think I chose this, Margaret? Do you think I wanted their cries in my ears every night? No, but they are the price. And if we turn away now, the marsh will not stop. It will take us too. Do you want that? Margaret collapsed to her knees, weeping uncontrollably, whispering prayers into her hands. Agnes stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with a mix of rage and terror. So, this is the truth, she said hoarsely. We are not cursed. We are chained. Chained to your bargain. Eliza tilted her head, her crow echoing her movement. Not mine, sister, ours. You have lived by it as much as I. Every harvest, every winter when others starved and we did not. It was the marsh that gave us those gifts. You benefited as much as I. Agnes staggered back as though struck. She wanted to deny it, but the truth pressed down on her like the fog outside. Margaret's sobs filled the room, broken and pitiful. Eliza stood at last, her presence tall, commanding. She moved to the window and placed her hand on the glass. The fog outside seemed to thicken, pressing against her palm. They are waiting, you know. The children, the marsh. It will call again, and when it does, we will answer. Agnes stared at her sister, trembling. And if we refuse? Eliza turned her head slowly, her pale smile sharp as a blade. Then we become the harvest. The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. The house groaned against the wind, the reeds whispering outside like voices. Margaret rocked on the floor, whispering prayers that went unanswered. Agnes stood frozen, the weight of the bargain crushing her. And Eliza, serene, pale, and unyielding, stroked her crow's feathers as if she were the keeper of all their fates. The marsh was silent now. But its silence was not peace, it was hunger, and the sisters knew it would not be long before it called again. The storm arrived without warning. Dark clouds churned above the marsh, thick and bruised with lightning. The wind howled through the reeds, bending them like rows of trembling bones. Rain lashed the crooked windows of the Grimshaw house, sharp and relentless. Inside, the sisters huddled together in the flickering glow of a single candle, the flame shivering in the draught. Margaret sat in the corner, clutching her rosary so tightly the beads had carved into her palms. Her lips moved constantly, whispering, prayers that were swallowed by the storm. Agnes paced the floor, her steps quick and uneven, like a trapped animal searching for escape. Eliza, as always, stood tall by the window, her crow perched above her shoulder. Her face was calm, though her pale eyes gleamed with a feverish light. "They're coming," she said softly, her voice almost lost beneath the thunder. Agnes stopped, pacing. "Who?" Eliza turned her head, smiling faintly. "The children." Even through the storm, they heard it then, the faintest cries carried on the wind. Soft, pitiful wails, rising and falling like a lullaby twisted into a curse. Margaret let out a strangled cry, pressing her hands over her ears. "No, not again. I can't bear it." Agnes's breath quickened. "Eliza, what have you done? You said they were bound, but this is different." Eliza's crow flapped its wings, letting out a sharp, grating caw. "The bargain is old, Agnes. Older than us. Older than this village. The marsh has feasted for centuries. It is not content to sleep forever. Tonight, it wants more." The candle flickered violently, the flame stretching unnaturally high before guttering low. The sisters froze as the walls of the house groaned, wood warping as though under invisible hands. The cries outside grew louder, dozens of voices wailing in unison. Margaret shrieked and crawled toward the door. "I won't stay here, I won't die in this cursed place!" Agnes grabbed her arm. "Margaret, no! The marsh!" But before she could finish, the door slammed open with a deafening crack, ripped from its hinges by the storm. The sisters screamed as icy wind and rain burst into the room, and in the doorway stood shapes, small, shadowy figures, dozens of them. Their forms were faint, little more than outlines in the rain, but their faces, oh, their faces, pale, bloated, eyes wide and black as the marsh water. Tiny mouths opened in voiceless screams, their cries echoing in the sisters' skulls, though no lips moved. Margaret collapsed to her knees, sobbing, "God help us! God help us!" Agnes stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her heart pounded like a drum. These were the children, all of them, every infant that had been lost to the reeds. Their tiny hands reached forward, not in innocence, but in hunger. Eliza stepped forward, her face serene, almost radiant. "Do you see them, sisters? Do you see what we are? This is our legacy. They are ours, and we are theirs." The children surged forward, pouring into the house like a tide of shadows. Their cold presence swept across the floorboards, extinguishing the candle with a hiss. The room plunged into darkness, broken only by flashes of lightning outside. Agnes screamed as icy fingers brushed her ankle. She stumbled back, tripping over a chair. Margaret thrashed in the corner, clawing at the floor as though she could dig her way out. But Eliza did not move. She lifted her arms, welcoming the storm, welcoming the dead. Her crow shrieked and launched itself into the swirling chaos, wings beating like black thunder. "Come, little ones," Eliza whispered, her voice carrying strangely over the cries. "Your harvest is here." The figures swarmed around her, clinging to her legs, her arms, her shoulders. Their cries rose into a single piercing wail that shook the house to its bones. And Eliza only smiled, her face lit by lightning, as though she had become their queen. Agnes reached for her sister, screaming above the storm. "Eliza, stop! They'll kill us!" But Eliza only turned her pale gaze toward her, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "No, Agnes, they will keep us." The floor shuddered beneath their feet, the wood cracking, splintering. Black water seeped up through the boards, rising fast, filling the room with the stench of rot and decay. The marsh was no longer outside. It was here, inside the house, claiming what was owed. Margaret's screams gurgled as the water reached her mouth. Agnes fought to stay standing, her hands clawing at the walls. Eliza stood tall in the rising flood, the shadow children clinging to her like a shroud, and in that moment, Agnes knew. There was no escape. The marsh had come for its harvest. By morning, the storm was gone. The village of Hollow's Bend awoke to an eerie calm. Mist hung heavy over the marsh, thicker than usual, muffling every sound. The air smelled of iron and salt, sharp and strange, as though the earth itself had been wounded. When the first villagers reached the Grimshaw house, they stopped in silence. The once crooked cottage now sagged as if broken by unseen hands. Its roof caved in, windows shattered, door ripped from its hinges. Mud and reeds clung to the walls, as though the marsh had crawled inside and made itself at home. No one spoke as they crossed the threshold. Inside, the floor was warped and waterlogged. Black marsh water still pooled in the corners. But what struck them most was the silence. No voices, no cries, only the creak of broken wood. The sisters were gone. Margaret's rosary was found snapped, beads scattered across the floor like spilled seeds. Agnes's shawl clung to a nail, torn as though ripped from her shoulders in a struggle. And on the table, untouched by flood or decay, sat Eliza's crow, its feathers slick with water, its pale eyes fixed on the intruders. When one man reached to shoo it away, the bird let out a piercing cry that made his blood run cold, because it was not the call of a crow. It was the cry of an infant. The villagers fled the house, whispering prayers, clutching their children close. None dared to speak of what they had seen aloud, though all of them knew the truth. The Grimshaw sisters had not merely vanished. They had been taken, claimed, bound forever to the swamp they had served. That night, and on every storm since, the marsh has carried their voices. Travelers tell of hearing women weeping through the reeds, joined by the soft cries of babies. Farmers say the water sometimes ripples with shadows shaped like small hands, and on rare, cursed nights, when lightning strikes the marsh, some claim to see 3 pale figures standing in the flood, their eyes glowing faintly, watching, one woman clutching her rosary, one weeping, lost in grief, and one smiling, crowned. By crows the Grimshaw sisters, and still the marsh waits for more. Every few decades, when the reeds grow too thick and the air turns too still, another child vanishes from Hollow's Bend. Some are found days later, drowned in shallow water. Others are never found at all. The villagers whisper, "It is the harvest." Continuing, Eliza's bargain, still alive, still hungry. And so, the marsh has earned its name, the Hollow Womb, a place where life begins and ends, a place where the cries of the lost never stop. Because once the marsh has taken you, it never lets you go. And so ends the tale of the Grimshaw sisters, 3 women whose names were buried in whispers, yet whose cries still haunt the marshes of Maine. Some call it folklore, others call it truth, but in Hollow's Bend, no one dares to question the moo reeds when they begin to sing. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of forgotten history, make sure to stay with us. Subscribe to Behind the Genius, because every story we uncover keeps me motivated to bring you more of the dark, the strange, and the terrifying corners of our past. Your support is the reason I can dig up files that America and the world once tried to forget. And trust me, there are still so many stories waiting in the dark. So until next time, listen closely, watch carefully, and never forget. The past is never really gone. It's only waiting to be found.